Okay, so before we get into that, we need to perhaps talk about the term conspiracy theory, because this is something that's going to come up right away whenever you talk about, whether or not we're heading towards totalitarianism, whether or not there's something more sinister going on with the transgender agenda. So let's just talk about the term conspiracy theory, because my opponents will no doubt throw that term at me immediately. People need to understand that conspiracy is standard operating procedure for governments. Okay, governments are constantly conspiring against the people. They have secret meetings and they use propaganda to try to manipulate people to think and behave in certain ways. We see this all the time. The best example that I like to use for the way the government operates in this regard is the incubator baby fiasco. Or scandal that was used to justify the first Iraq war. So what had happened was that Iraq had invaded Kuwait because there was like an oil dispute, and the U.S. actually gave Iraq the thumbs up to go into Kuwait, but it looks like they did that just because they wanted a pretext to go after Iraq. But in any case, Iraq had gone into Kuwait and sort of taken over there to try to rectify their oil dispute. And the public in the United States and in Canada, for that matter, had watched this, but nobody was really interested in getting involved in a war over this, because essentially it was a dispute over oil by a couple of Middle East states. So there wasn't a whole lot of support for launching a war. The U.S. government, however, wanted to launch a war. So what appeared in the news quite quickly was this story that the Iraqi soldiers had gone into hospitals in Kuwait, and they had unplugged incubators where babies were. They'd taken the babies out of the incubators and tossed them on the floor, and they had left them there to die. And on the news, we saw this young girl who was supposedly a young nurse who says she had witnessed all this and witnessed the dying babies, and she was, crying and talking about how terrible it was.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Naira, and I just came out of Kuwait. While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, took the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor. It was horrifying.
And then they had a doctor come on who was very stern and serious and talking about the crime against humanity that this was to kill these babies in this ruthless way.
I myself buried 14 newborn babies that had been taken from their incubators.
So this story went out to the public, and that sort of changed public opinion. And suddenly more people than not supported invading Iraq, and they were able to invade Iraq. The only problem was that whole scenario was staged, right? They had used actually professional companies to coach the young girl and the doctor on how to act and what to say. So this was essentially a whole staged display and presented to the world as a real event and real news. And it was done deliberately, knowingly, by the government, by the parties involved, to manipulate people and to get them to do exactly what they wanted to do. So this was a form of propaganda, and that's the way government works. Now, I was suspicious of that when I saw it at the time. Now, if I had told people at the time that, I think this is all faked, and this is just a bunch of bull, and they're using this to justify a war, well, no doubt the people in power would have said, well, that's just a conspiracy theory. Where's your tinfoil hat? You're just a conspiracy kook. The only problem was that it was true, right? So the thing is that government uses propaganda on a regular basis to deceive people. And propaganda is a conspiracy against the public. Now, when governments are engaging in this kind of deception, they don't tell people what they're doing, right? You can't tell people what you're up to because that would blow, the whole project and you wouldn't achieve what you want to achieve. So what do we do as people when the government is, so prone to using propaganda and lies and stuff against us? What are we as people supposed to do? Just believe them, whatever they're doing, just believe them and assume that they've got our best interests at heart? If you don't agree with that, and that's a very limited option. It's like, just agree with them and let them do whatever they want. Well, I don't think that's acceptable. In the case of the Iraq War, that resulted in millions of deaths, right? So we as people, I think, have an obligation to try to, be watchful and be aware of what our governments are up to. And when they do things that don't seem to make sense, whether that's, this fake incubator baby story, or whether they're coming to you and saying that boys can be girls, girls can be boys, that men can be women, when they're saying suspicious stuff like that, we have to stop and say, wait a second. This is counterintuitive. This doesn't make sense. What are these guys up to? And that's basically all we can really do. It's, theorizing. We have to come up with a theory. So conspiracy theory is not something that should be frowned upon, because if you don't theorize, you're never going to figure out what's really going on with these people. It's just like police officers when they're investigating crimes. They have to theorize. They have to speculate. If a police officer couldn't theorize about what's happened in a case of a crime where they don't know exactly what's going on, if they couldn't theorize, they wouldn't be able to solve their crimes. It's the same thing with us and what big government is up to, okay? Unless we're willing to engage in theories, in some cases conspiracy theories, because the government does engage in conspiracies against the people, we have to theorize and try to figure out what they're up to. So we as people, I think, have an obligation to try to, be watchful and be aware of what our governments are up to.